Well, over on BBC Two shortly, there's comedy in the American series Rhoda, starring Valerie Harper. This is BBC One, and it's just coming up to 9 o'clock. And that's time for the news with Julia Somerville.
Not guilty, the airman in the Sex for Secrets trial. British Rail goes electric all the way to Scotland. The actor James Mason is dead. Ministers fume as Euro MPs veto Britain's rebate. And as the drought continues, water rationing is on the way. Good evening. The young airman accused of passing secrets to an alleged Mata Hari has been acquitted. The jury at the Old Bailey took 6.5 hours to reach a not guilty verdict on 21-year-old Paul Davis. Ava Jafar, his alleged contact in Cyprus, wasn't there to hear the outcome. Davis was released immediately and left court with his mother and stepfather. Andrew Taylor was at the Old Bailey.
It was Ava Jafar's evidence as much as anything which convinced the jury of Davis's innocence. The woman the lawyers called a modern Mata Hari came to London to speak for him and try to clear her own name. Throughout the 3 weeks of the trial, Paul Davis seemed a most unlikely spy. He kept glancing across for support from his mother, who's been in court every day. When he collapsed in the dock, she dashed in tears, and when the not guilty verdicts were handed down, she heaved a sigh of relief. Davis himself was expressionless. He'd met Mrs. Jafar in a Cyprus discotheque where they danced together, provocatively, according to Davis. That started a relationship which he said was sexual, she said was purely platonic, and the prosecution said was treasonable. They said Mrs. Jafar wasn't interested in company, but in communications secrets. In military terms, everyone in Cyprus is eavesdropping on everyone else. It's NATO's main listening post in the Middle East, and it handled all the communications in the recent Lebanon crisis. Every Warsaw Pact nation has an embassy there. The Russians alone have 44 accredited diplomats. How many of them are interested in military secrets rather than diplomacy isn't known. There have been several security scares. A group of servicemen is due in court in September on secrets charges. Paul Davis's association with a sophisticated Hungarian-born beauty, 10 years his senior, came under scrutiny at once, and Mrs. Jafar became a prime espionage suspect. Today's verdicts do nail those accusations of spying, but they leave her without a real chance to rebut the sexual innuendos, even though she denied them in the witness box. The newspapers love the Mata Hari tag, and the implications of that, she said, have wrecked her marriage and ruined her life. For Paul Davis, the trial ended in relief as he walked out of the Old Bailey to the cheers of the crowd. Ava Jafar has to go home to Beirut to face a threatened divorce and the loss of her 3 children.
The government's making its biggest investment in British Rail for 25 years. £306 million will be spent on electrifying the East Coast Main Line from London to Edinburgh. The Transport Secretary, Nicholas Ridley, said the project was fully justified on its financial merits and will give customers a better service. Jimmy Knapp, leader of the biggest rail union, said the government had at long last acknowledged the overwhelming case for the electrification of the line. 32 miles between London and Hitchin have already been electrified. The first stage of the new scheme will take electrification as far as Newcastle, and the second, to Edinburgh, will complete the project by 1991.
British Rail's been pressing for 6 years to replace the rolling stock on the run from King's Cross to Edinburgh, BR's second most important trunk route. When the electrification work's complete, it'll shave 10 minutes off the journey, bringing it down to 4 hours 20 minutes. Electric trains have the same top speed, 125 miles an hour, as diesels, but accelerate quicker. Time apart, the main gain is that electric trains are more economical. The BR chairman said today that the government isn't giving him any extra money. The board will be funding the whole scheme. So it's essential, he said, that railmen avoid the sort of disruptive action they've taken in the miners' strike.
We have to make sure that we don't get days of action associated with this particular problem, which does affect our passenger business, and we've had a number of those. That loses us revenue, it loses us the confidence of our customers, and they go elsewhere to the competitor.
Mr. Reed's highly regarded by the government, and he's had more success than his predecessors in getting the East Coast scheme the green light. It takes investment in BR over the last 9 months to £436 million, of which £340 million is for electrification projects. In the past, ministers linked new investment to efficiency. BR failed to push through new productivity measures in its last pay deal in May. But ministers apparently believe there's been enough general improvement over the past couple of years to back the scheme and the major boost it gives to intercity.
The pound has had another bad day on the foreign exchanges. It closed in London at $1.31.1 cents, a drop of 2 cents on the day because of fears about falling oil prices. In Rotterdam, North Sea oil is being sold at about $3 a barrel below the official price, and the Russians are reported to have made a temporary cut of $1.50 for their crude oil. There have also been rumours that the OPEC oil producers group may be splitting up, but the British National Oil Corporation says it hasn't yet had any formal request to renegotiate its prices. The actor James Mason died of a heart attack today at his home in Switzerland. He was 75. He was taken ill early this morning and died in hospital a few hours later. His final film, The Shooting Party with Sir John Gielgud, was completed earlier this year. With his second wife Clarissa, he's lived in Switzerland since 1962. Chris Lowe looks back at the career of one of Britain's finest film actors.
James Mason made over 130 films, yet strangely there was an element of failure in his career. Speaking shortly before his death, he said he had not achieved what he had set out to achieve. He never quite became an international superstar, though in his early years he came very close, with films like The Seventh Veil, in which he starred with Anne Todd.
You belong to me. We must always be together. You know that, don't you? Promise you'll stay with me always. Promise. Well, if that's the way you want it, very well. If you won't play for me, you shan't play for anyone else ever again.
I think he had excitement about his personality, whatever he was playing. And it wasn't just a name coming in as a star. He brought something very, of course, much bigger. And he had great sex appeal.
Indeed, so great was his popularity that in the late 40s he went to Hollywood, aiming to become an international leading man. But instead he acquired the image of a sinister foreigner, though a very good-looking one. He never won an Oscar, though he was nominated 3 times, first in 1954 for his performance in A Star is Born with Judy Garland. And 2 years ago he was nominated again, this time for his supporting role in The Verdict with Paul Newman. But for his final film, James Mason came home to star with Sir John Gielgud in The Shooting Party, which has not yet been released.
You don't approve of our sport, I fear. It's not my idea of sport. It's my idea of murder.
Ah, yes. It's all right, Klaus. We'll go on down to the marquee as soon as this drive is over.
Aye, sir.
Let the gentleman go, Charlie.
James Mason, the son of a Yorkshire cloth merchant, became one of the outstanding British actors of the last 40 years. And it happened almost by chance.
It happened rather accidentally, really, because I went into the business, that's to say theatre, to make a living, really. Because when I came down from Cambridge, nothing was happening. I was a trained architect at that time, but nobody was building anything. But I thought that I could make a living as an actor, so I went into the acting business. But the movies were coincidental, really, and I loved movies. I've always loved movies.
James Mason, who died today, his funeral will be held at the English church at Vevey, near his home, on Tuesday. The saga of Britain's budget battle with the European community goes on. The European Parliament has voted to block the repayment of our 1983 rebate. The money, £457 million, was held up while the long-term problem of Britain's budget contribution was sorted out. A deal was finally reached last month at the Fontainebleau summit, but the Euro MPs were angry that they hadn't been consulted. Their decision to veto the deal was immediately condemned. Foreign Office Minister Malcolm Rifkind called it contemptible, while Labour's EEC spokesman Robin Cook said Britain must now withhold UK contributions.
It was the Parliament's way of telling Britain what it thought of our attitude to Europe's financial crisis. And the figures, 212 to 70, showed how overwhelming the vote was. The reaction from British MEPs was equally unmistakable.
The rebate we are talking about is due to the United Kingdom, long overdue. It was promised at Stuttgart. That promise was reconfirmed at Fontainebleau. It was embodied in an agreement with Fontainebleau. And now this Parliament, which called for an agreement, has now smashed it apart.
I think the way the European Parliament have behaved is frankly contemptible, and I think it brings them into great disrepute. The background to this is that over the last few months, the European Parliament have successively laid down various conditions for the payment of the British refund. Each time that condition has been met, they've simply changed the conditions. Now that, frankly, is not a way to behave.
At Fontainebleau, where the refund and everything else about Britain's payments to the EEC seemed to have been sorted out, there was a sigh of relief all round that a long, unpleasant chapter in common market history was over. But it wasn't. Less than a month later, there were problems over how the community was going to pay its way for the rest of this year. Planned spending for 1984 is £17 billion, but that'll actually all be spent by November, and there's an estimated £1.2 billion extra that it'll need to be found. Britain's suggestions for raising this money were a mixture of better housekeeping, cancelling plans for slimming down the butter mountain, for instance, slowing down the disposal of sugar products, while deferring nearly £1,000 million worth of payments until the next financial year. But every one of the other countries preferred the idea of handing over an advance on their dues for next year, an idea which Britain has blocked. Once again, we were isolated. Hence the anger in the European Parliament against Britain today. The feeling among most MEPs is that by September, Britain will come round and do a deal on the community's overspending, while in London, British officials believe that the Parliament will change its mind and allow the refund to go through eventually.
The Foreign Secretary, Sir Geoffrey Howe, has arrived in Peking on a 4-day visit to discuss the future of Hong Kong. Britain's lease on most of the territory runs out in 1997, when control will be handed over to the Chinese. Peking says it wants a final agreement signed by September, but a number of problems remain to be resolved, and the people of Hong Kong fear their interests aren't being properly protected.
This was the second time in just over 3 months that the Foreign Secretary has visited Peking, and he has only one thing on his mind: the future of Hong Kong. He's hoping to achieve 3 objects: review progress, sort out problems, and get the next stage of negotiations going. Sir Geoffrey's trip has been described as a desperate mission. He doesn't look like a desperate man, but he was left in no doubt in Hong Kong earlier today about the concern of the 5.5 million people there. The problem is that Britain is going to hand over to China in 13 years' time a colony which is the world's 3rd biggest money market and container port, the world's biggest exporter of textiles, watches, and the toys that people buy at Christmas. As he flew out of Hong Kong in his Royal Air Force VC-10 today, Sir Geoffrey relaxed after a day being battered by Hong Kong representatives described by one official as very coherent.
Well, I've had a very busy 24 hours in Hong Kong.
During the weekend, Sir Geoffrey will have a series of talks with his Chinese counterpart, the Foreign Minister, and possibly with Chinese leaders like Deng Xiaoping. But then he has to return to Hong Kong and tell people what has been decided.
The Coal Board Chairman Ian McGregor says the NCB's latest peace plan is still on the table, even though it's been rejected by the miners' union. He said the board's position will be reviewed next week, but made it clear there could be no more concessions. There have been reports that Labour's energy spokesman Stan Orme might succeed in arranging new talks between the two sides. Mr McGregor was asked about this in an interview on BBC Radio.
We have no knowledge of that. What that means is that maybe somebody from Sheffield is going to call us and ask us to meet with them.
But you're not going to move?
I have no plans.
Why not?
Because when we met the last time, we had presented to the NUM a very fair attempt to solve the problem. We got no help from them. There was nothing done to approach us and to try to help resolve the issues.
Arthur Scargill was talking about his conditions for more talks with the Coal Board tonight. He addressed a rally in Wales after leading a miners' march through Abertillery.
We've been on strike for 21 weeks. And Mr. McGregor, if you think that we're going to go back, if you withdraw your pit closure plan, you're living in clout cuckoo land. You're going to have to resolve the wages question, a 4-day week, early retirement, and many other things that have been outstanding for 20 years. Why is it that there are still those in the labour and trade union movement, as well as in the media, talk about the attractiveness of redundancy? There isn't enough money can be contemplated to buy the job opportunity of one of our people. And I want to say to every miner, you have no right to even consider selling your job. It doesn't belong to you, it belongs to your daughter, to your son, and to your family.
A High Court judge has banned the GLC from implementing a multi-million-pound spending plan. It had been introduced on Thursday in a bid to beat the paving bill, which will curtail what councils can spend without government approval. Some reports suggest as much as £22 million had been approved. Tonight, the GLC is saying contracts have already been signed. Cut down or be cut off. That's the prospect facing 21 million people in Britain because of the drought. And the government warned today that water rationing is inevitable in some areas unless there's a drastic cut in demand. Rationing could start soon in South Wales, and in Devon and Cornwall the date's already been set, August the 9th. It seems some consumers have taken notice of earlier warnings. In the Torbay area, demand is down by 11%, and in Plymouth by 21%, but even greater savings are needed.
At the meeting of the South West Water Authority on Wednesday, an appeal was made for a reduction of 50% in the consumption of water. If that request is heeded, then we may be able to avoid rationing, but the authority has made it clear that unless there is an immediate response to this request for economy, then we will have to have rationing, unless, of course, we have substantial rainfall between now and the 9th of August.
The dry spell has created some unusual problems around the country. In Northumberland, a village near the huge Kielder Reservoir is short of water. And in Avon, a dream trip for steam enthusiasts turned into a nightmare for firemen.
The Merchant Navy-class loco Clan Line literally blazed a trail across a parched countryside. It was the engine's first outing after a major overhaul. Wiltshire Fire Brigade were called out 5 times to put out fires along the embankment. But in neighbouring Avon, things were much worse. The brigade was summoned to 10 fires along the track, and some of them had spread to crops in nearby fields. An estimated 90 acres of corn have been destroyed at 2 separate locations. So many fire engines had to be brought from Bristol that others from further away were called to provide cover in the city.
For the past 10 days, this has been the ritual for the 65 inhabitants of Ingo in mid-Northumberland. They're on the end of the main supply, and a heavier than usual demand from farmers to water their stock in the dry weather has meant a serious drop in water pressure. The taps in the village run for only a few hours each day, so they're storing extra supplies in the bath. The villagers are angry because there's no official drought in the area, and just 25 miles away is the biggest man-made lake in Europe. Meanwhile, the Water Board is bringing in extra pumps to top up small local reservoirs. They say a regular supply should be restored to the village in the next day or 2.
In southern France, fire has destroyed 3,000 acres of forest near the town of Tretz, northeast of Marseille. 1,500 firefighters and 300 soldiers struggled to control the blaze. Campsites and holiday homes were evacuated during the night as the flames spread, fanned by winds of up to 50 miles an hour. At dawn, the authorities brought in aircraft to waterbomb the flames, but lack of rain and the strong Mistral wind mean the blaze could flare up again. At Livorno in Italy, 2 sculptures, apparently by Modigliani, have been dredged up from a canal. The artist is said to have thrown them there 75 years ago, when some of his friends laughed at their primitive style. City officials think they're genuine, but just to make sure, they're having the stone analysed scientifically. 40 of Europe's crack parachute troops have been joining battle in Britain this week as part of NATO's Challenge 84 operation. At stake, their reputations. And as our defence correspondent Christopher Wayne reports, it was supposed to promote friendly rivalry.
The contest comprised a typical Special Forces mission. After parachuting in, contestants had to swim 100 meters in full uniform, orientate themselves across country, and finally prove their skill in marksmanship. It's supposed to be a contest designed to cement the bonds of friendship between NATO parachute schools. In reality, it's been as competitive as the Olympics. Some national teams spent almost a year training for this one event. By this morning, the West Germans had emerged as favourites to win, and the real tussle was to be in the top half of the league table. Barely had the shooting started when the protests began. None of the other teams cared for the British self-loading rifle, and there was indignation when competitors who'd fired 10 rounds discovered 11 or 12 bullet holes in their targets. Then the British team of RAF parachute instructors complained about the Italians, who weren't wearing jumpsuits, but were wearing eye patches, both violations of the rules. Eventually, it was all sorted out, and Challenge 84 ended with one Portuguese broken arm, one Spanish broken leg, and a lot of injured national pride. The hard-pressed umpire suggested that next year, the judges should come from the Warsaw Pact.
The West Indies have amassed 500 runs in their first innings in the fourth Cornhill Test, setting England a huge problem if they're to avoid another defeat. As David Cass reports, even the West Indies' worst batsman easily mastered the English attack.
Night watchmen like Winston Davis, who usually bat last, are not expected to stay around and score a half-century the next day. It's a measure of West Indies' strength that Davis not only did that, but demoralised England's bowlers into losing their accuracy as well. He scored almost as quickly as his illustrious partner Gordon Greenidge. Only Greenidge's finer technique separated the two performances in entertainment value. Greenidge scored his second double century of the series and passed his previous best score. Davis was finally clean bowled, to the obvious relief of the veteran spinner Pat Pocock, who gave England some reason to celebrate by also bowling Baptiste in the very next over. In the gathering gloom after the fifth interruption for bad light or rain, Greenidge too finally succumbed to the guile of Pocock. He'd scored 223 runs. West Indies were 470 for 8, and had only added one more when Holding fell to Cook for an uncharacteristic duck. Pocock ended the innings having Garner caught by Paul Terry, 4 wickets in his first test for 8 years. And that's a daunting total for England when they bat tomorrow, knowing that West Indies are already beyond defeat. In the Britannic Assurance County Championship, Derbyshire gained their first victory of the season, and there were also wins for Middlesex and Warwickshire. All the other matches were drawn.
And the main points again. The young airman at the centre of the so-called Mata Hari secrets trial has been acquitted. British Rail are to electrify the East Coast main line from London to Edinburgh, their biggest investment in 25 years. And James Mason, one of Britain's most outstanding film actors, has died of a heart attack in Switzerland. And finally, the beauty business can be beastly, especially if you live in Winchester. The organisers of the city's beauty contest hoped hundreds would turn up to see Miss Winchester crowned, but only 6 have bought tickets for the show.
It was to have been Winchester's Night of the Year, a completely new function to give the Miss Winchester title new prestige. But the people of Winchester aren't interested. Even when the organisers decided to give the £5 tickets away today, they found it difficult to get rid of them. And as if that wasn't enough, the Carnival Committee faced yet another setback this afternoon. The favourite among the 5 Miss Winchester finalists suddenly pulled out with no explanation. They were pressing on regardless this evening with all the arrangements, but facing up to the prospect that far from the 500 people they'd expected would fill the dance hall tonight, it could turn out to be very empty indeed, and the contestants extremely lonely on the catwalk.
It's
pure hysteria. Really, it's just going to be a catastrophe if people don't come along tonight, an absolute catastrophe.
The festival committee has certainly been desperate to attract people to the ball. The 800 or so pounds they stand to lose will only be offset by bar takings and raffles. So tonight, Winchester goes into the history books once more, the first city to say, have a ball on us.
And the latest news we have is 70 people have turned up and the organisers have gone out into the streets appealing for more to come along. Oh dear. And the late headlines will be at 11:15. Till then, good night.
In Newsnight this evening, the Prime Minister will be interviewed live from Downing Street by John Tusa. That's Mrs. Thatcher in Newsnight at 10:35 tonight on BBC Two.
Good evening to you. Well, there was some rain over the country today. This time it was all up over northern parts of Britain, where this warm front, in fact, brought the bulk of it as it moved eastwards across Scotland, Northern Ireland. Just seeing a few drops, actually. Most of the heavier rain's really been confined to Scotland itself. And some of that rain just coming down that eastern side of England now, but really very little left to come, and I think from now onwards the fronts that we're going to see over us, this cold front, for example, will be a fairly weak feature as it comes further southwards. Quite a breeze picking up at times, but it is a warm westerly wind, so warm in fact that temperatures today, for example, in parts of the south reached 31 centigrade. In fact, that was at London Airport. That's 88 degrees Fahrenheit. The high pressure you can see extending across towards Central Europe, and there is that strong Mistral wind that's fanning those fires in southern France. I think the winds there will die down later in the weekend. That low, despite its name, is giving some fairly fine weather over Spain, and we can see that actually on the satellite picture, because this one taken at 7 p.m. shows all of the cloud now filling much of the North Sea, the white clouds, the clouds that's bringing the rain, and the cold front stringing out here across the Atlantic. Fine weather to the south of us, very hot weather today over Spain, temperatures well into the 30s centigrade, and all of this cloud's going to carry its unsettled weather across central and eastern parts of Europe. So for us tomorrow, if you're staying at home, well, a fine dry day in the south, some sunshine, perhaps rather hazy sunshine at times, one or two patches of mist around the coasts, and then a band of rather cloudy weather, I think, through central parts, the odd spot or two of light rain and drizzle, nothing too much, I don't think, and in eastern areas the sun should get through later on, and where the sun does get through, turning out very warm indeed, temperatures well into the 70s. And for the second half of the weekend, things are changing very little close to home, although I think we'll find that band of cloudier weather edging a bit further south, but still very warm nonetheless. Not a great quantity of rain anywhere, the unsettled weather over central and eastern Europe, and staying hot and sunny in the Mediterranean, but perhaps, I think, turning thundery over western Spain and Portugal later on. That's it. A very good evening to you.
On BBC Two now, in Women of Our Century, the accolade falls on a long-neglected painter who was one of a group of artists who contributed to the revolution in modern art in the 1920s, Paul Vasley. Here on One in a moment, Starsky and Hutch.